COVID-19 and Russia. The National Eating Disorder Association says that there is a gap in insurance coverage for treatment because the state's definition of this illness is too limited. Currently, only anorexia and bulimia are covered. There are other disorders, however, that can be just as physically and mentally threatening, and treatment can cost more than $30,000 a month. So now a pair of state lawmakers is sponsoring a bill to expand the definition and get more coverage. Here to explain more, we have Assemblywoman Nily Rozic and Mysko from the National Eating Disorder Association. Thank you so much, everybody. It's great to have you both here.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, so first of all, this, it cannot, and Claire, we'll start with you, it cannot be underestimated how big of a problem this is. And I think that most people think it's prevailing on women, but it's actually men and women, correct?
That's right. Eating disorders are a serious, life-threatening set of illnesses, and they can affect anyone of all ages, of all ethnicities, men and women. Anyone can get an eating disorder, and 30 million Americans will struggle with an eating disorder at some point in their lives.
Do we know what percentage of people are going untreated, perhaps because they're not diagnosed and or because they can't get coverage for full treatment?
We know certainly through our helpline, the National Eating Disorders Association runs a helpline. People can call us for support to get connected to treatment options. And this issue with access to care is a huge one. It's top of the list. So there are many people who are flying under the radar. And so when we talk about the numbers, that doesn't necessarily reflect the numbers of people out there who aren't currently in treatment or aren't able to access treatment.
And when we're talking about not anorexia or bulimia, which I think are probably the two that most people that come to mind, but there's also, I mean, is binging and purging not a behavior set that's part and parcel of one of those two?
So eating disorders are very complex illnesses. Obviously, there are very serious medical consequences, but there also is a psychological component. So treatment really does need to be comprehensive. It needs to address all of these pieces. Anorexia and bulimia, as you mentioned, are the most covered in terms of when we hear the term eating disorder, that's typically what people think of. But in fact, there is a huge amount of diversity within the illness when we say eating disorders. So binge eating disorder is one eating disorder that is in the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. And that's characterized by binging, but without the purging, without the compensatory behavior like vomiting or taking laxatives that's associated with bulimia.
So, Assemblywoman, how did it come to your attention that this was a particular problem, and also that this coverage gap, the legislation would make the definition broader or more general?
So look, everyone knows someone who's been affected by an eating disorder, and typically, yes, as Claire mentioned, you do think of either anorexia or bulimia, but there's a whole spectrum of types and cases and disorders. And I came across this issue through a couple of people that I knew who had been impacted, and quite frankly, there's a gap in the insurance for many cases. And so, great organizations like NEDA walk you through that, but really the state law should be reflective of all kinds of eating disorders. So we're introducing legislation and hope to pass it that would address all kinds of eating disorders. It redefines it to include a lot of the more intricate cases that Claire mentioned.
And we've seen the governor use his executive powers in response to the movement at the DC level for changing the Affordable Care Act. Could not the executive, and also, for example, mandating coverage of contraception, right, at the state level, could not the executive act in that manner, or a legislative fix would be more comprehensive and also last longer, regardless of whoever's sitting in the governor's office?
Right, I think it would last longer. The current state law does address anorexia and bulimia. It doesn't sort of address the DSM definitions that have come into place since then. So I feel like healthcare is on everyone's minds, and we want everyone to be on board with this, but a fix in the law would go a long way.
If in fact there are changes at the federal level, I mean, not to get too deep in the weeds on that, but are people going to lose their coverage of this? Because if I remember correctly, eating disorders fell into the pre-existing condition category.
Yes, we're keeping a very close watch on what's happening at the federal level. There was, as part of the 21st Century Cures Act, which was passed, there was the first federal piece of legislation that actually mentioned eating disorders, the Anna Weston Act, which was led by a mother who lost her daughter to her battle with an eating disorder. And so, we were very pleased to see that happen, but we're certainly very concerned about and keeping an eye on what's happening at the federal level.
So, Assemblywoman, this doesn't strike me as a terribly partisan. And is this the first year that you're trying?
This is the first year.
Okay, so it would be an opportunity for lawmakers on both sides of the aisle to demonstrate, in fact, that they have a knowledge and care about the healthcare issue, right? And it isn't terribly political.
It's not political. As I mentioned, everyone knows someone who's been impacted. And I think for a long time, kind of generally eating disorders as an issue has been bipartisan and has gained a lot of support in the legislature. In 2005, we created these comprehensive care centers across the state, not just in New York City. There's one in Albany Medical Center, there's one in the University of Rochester that will help men and women get the coverage that they need.
And as you mentioned to me before we came on the air, you've got a majority sponsor in the Senate. It's Kathy Marchone, and she's got one of those centers in her district. I would assume that motivated her interest in this, in signing on.
She does. She has one right in Saratoga and has been a very strong supporter of this legislation.
So the conversations that you've been having at the Capitol have been positive up until this point?
They have been. We had a number of meetings today, and we've seen a really positive response. This is an issue that affects everybody. Everybody knows somebody who has been affected by an eating disorder, and what we're trying to do here is really ensure that people can get the treatment they need and the recovery they deserve.
Why is it so expensive?
Well, eating disorders are very complex illnesses, and they require, there's a medical component, and there's also the psychological component and the nutrition component. So, for eating disorders treatment to be most effective, you really do need that team approach. But what I will say is that when people get the treatment they need, recovery is possible. And when they're booted out of treatment too early or they're access care, the problem becomes more and more entrenched and harder to treat and more expensive.
Have you had a conversation with leadership about this one? Because, we've been having this discussion. There's 10 days left, and you don't have a really long to-do list. And there's been sort of a laundry list of, like, mid-level items, right? I mean, I'm not trying to downplay the importance of this. It's very important, but it's, not ethics reform, for example, which we're also talking about. But does the Assembly Speaker say that this has a possibility?
So we've moved it through 2 different committees. It's on the floor of the Assembly right now. I'm really hopeful that we'll pass it in the next 10 days in the short time that we have. Obviously, there are a lot of priorities for a lot of different members, but this is one that I feel really strongly about in getting done.
Just before I let you go, I mean, we're having a lot of conversations because of potential block granting of Medicaid funding, et cetera. I mean, is this going to increase costs to the state? Do you have any idea how much this would cost? Because when you expand treatment and allow people to access what they need, that includes Medicaid patients, I would assume, correct?
So this is already part of the essential benefits that the state has to cover, and by just expanding the definition, we're including some of the lesser known eating disorders. We're not trying to disrupt coverage or change coverage whatsoever.
But you don't expect a large cost to the state at this point?
I haven't seen exact numbers, but I would not anticipate that.
Yeah.
Not so much. Okay. So again, we're sort of keeping track of a lot of different things. I thank you so much for coming in, both of you, and we will see what happens. 10 days in Albany is like, an eternity. So we will see. We do have to take another short break, but when we do come back, we'll be discussing the growing pressure from progressives for the state to take on Trump. Stay with us.